On the night of March 15, 1857, 7 of New Orleans' most powerful white businessmen sat down to dinner in a private room at the St. Charles Hotel, the most exclusive establishment in the South. They were celebrating a deal worth $200,000, a fortune that would make them kings of the cotton trade. The wine was French, the cigars Cuban, the silverware imported from London. They laughed and toasted their success, secure in their power, confident in their future. None of them noticed the tall black waiter who moved silently through the room, refilling glasses and clearing plates. None of them recognized him as the runaway slave worth $5,000 reward, the man whose face was on wanted posters from Mississippi to Maryland. None of them understood that the elegant, educated servant attending their table was actually the mastermind who controlled half the illegal commerce in New Orleans, who owned 3 gambling houses, 2 brothels, and a smuggling operation that moved everything from stolen slaves to opium. None of them suspected that before the night ended, 3 of them would be dead, 2 would be bankrupt, and the remaining 2 would become unwilling partners in the most audacious criminal enterprise the American South had ever seen. His name was Solomon King. He was 34 years old, and he had transformed himself from plantation property into the Phantom of New Orleans, a ghost who walked freely through a city that would hang him if they knew who he really was. This is the story of how a man born in chains became the first black crime lord in American history, how he built an empire in plain sight of those hunting him, and how he used the weapons of his oppressors, money, violence, and corruption, to carve out a kingdom of his own in the shadows of slavery. This is the story of the man they called the Phantom. If you're watching this, subscribe and turn on notifications. This is a story about transformation, about survival, about a man who understood that in a world built on stolen labor and human trafficking, the only way to be free was to become more ruthless than the slaveholders themselves. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. This is history they tried to erase. Solomon King was born Marcus Johnson in 1823 on the Riverside Plantation in Natchez, Mississippi, the bastard son of the master's youngest brother and an enslaved woman named Dinah. His parentage was an open secret, visible in his lighter skin, his sharp features, his eyes that were more gray than brown. But white blood meant nothing under the law. His mother was a slave, which made him a slave, property to be bought and sold like the horses in the stable or the furniture in the big house. What his white father did give him, whether intentionally or through guilty conscience, was education. The master's brother, Charles Johnson, was a drunk and a gambler who would die of syphilis before Marcus turned 10. But in those early years, Charles would sometimes visit the quarters late at night, reeking of bourbon, and teach his illegitimate son to read using old newspapers and discarded books. It was illegal, dangerous, and Charles did it more to spite his older brother than out of any paternal affection. But the result was that by age 8, Marcus could read and write better than most white children in Mississippi. His mother, Dinah, was careful to hide this knowledge. She understood that an enslaved boy who could read was dangerous to himself and others. She made Marcus pretend ignorance during the day, made him speak in the broken dialect white people expected, made him shuffle and bow and play the role of the simple slave child. But at night, she taught him other lessons. Lessons about survival, about reading white faces and predicting white moods, about when to be visible and when to disappear. She taught him that the system was built on lies, that slaveholders were not superior beings, but merely lucky predators. And she taught him that someday, somehow, he would have to choose between surviving and living. Marcus was 16 when his mother died of cholera. The plantation doctor refused to treat enslaved people during the epidemic, saying his services were needed for white patients. Marcus watched his mother die over 3 days, delirious with fever, crying out for water that no one would bring. He buried her himself in the slave cemetery, in a grave marked only by a wooden cross that would rot away in a year. And something fundamental broke inside him that day. Not his spirit, but his willingness to accept the rules of the world he'd been born into. He was sold away from Riverside 6 months later, purchased by a cotton merchant named Nathaniel Crawford, who needed skilled house servants for his New Orleans townhouse. The sale price was $800, which Crawford considered a bargain for a light-skinned, intelligent young man who could read and do arithmetic. The journey from Natchez to New Orleans took 2 weeks by riverboat. Marcus chained in the hold with 30 other enslaved people being shipped downriver to the slave markets of the Crescent City. New Orleans in 1839 was the 4th largest city in America, a seething cauldron of cultures and languages, where French Creoles mixed with American frontiersmen, where free people of color lived alongside enslaved Africans, where fortunes were made and lost on cotton, sugar, and human flesh. The city had a darker side, too, a criminal underworld that operated in the shadows of respectability. Smuggling operations that moved everything from stolen goods to contraband slaves, gambling dens and brothels that catered to every vice imaginable. Nathaniel Crawford was a respectable merchant on the surface, a deacon at the First Baptist Church, a member of the Chamber of Commerce, married with 4 children. But Marcus quickly discovered that his master had a second life. Crawford owned several properties in the Vieux Carré that he rented to criminals, took a percentage from illegal gambling operations, and had financial interests in brothels that served wealthy white men. He was a businessman who understood that sin was profitable, and he used Marcus to help manage this shadow empire. For 5 years, Marcus served Crawford, learning the mechanics of the criminal underworld, seeing how money moved through illegal channels, understanding how corrupt politicians and police could be bought, watching how power really worked beneath the genteel surface of New Orleans society. He was still a slave, still property, but Crawford gave him unusual freedoms. Marcus could move through the city running errands, could handle money, could interact with free people of color and even poor whites in the course of his master's business. He was invisible and omnipresent at once, the perfect spy who heard everything and was noticed by no one. And he was planning his escape. Not a desperate run for the north, which would mean months of danger and hardship with low odds of success. Marcus wanted something more permanent, more powerful. He wanted to disappear not by leaving, but by becoming someone else entirely. Someone who could exist in plain sight, protected not by distance, but by money and fear and connections. His opportunity came in September 1844, when Marcus was 21 years old. Crawford had arranged a large gambling night at one of his properties, a high-stakes poker game for wealthy planners visiting the city. Marcus was serving drinks and watching the game when he saw his chance. One of the players, a drunk cotton baron from Alabama, had won big, nearly $3,000 in cash and promissory notes sitting on the table in front of him. The man was so intoxicated he could barely count his chips. The other players were distracted, arguing about politics and slavery. Crawford had stepped out to smoke a cigar. Marcus moved smoothly to clear glasses from the table, his hands quick and practiced. In the space of 30 seconds, he palmed a stack of bills totaling $400 and 3 promissory notes worth $200 each. No one noticed. He continued serving for another hour, smiling and booing, invisible in his servitude. When the game broke up around 3 a.m., Marcus walked out of the building and didn't return. He didn't run. Running attracted attention. Instead, he walked calmly through the French Quarter to a small room he had rented months earlier under a false name. paying with money he'd carefully stolen over months. He had prepared for this moment with the same patience his mother had taught him, assembling everything he would need. Forged freedom papers purchased from a criminal who specialized in such documents. A suit of good clothes stolen piece by piece from Crawford's other servants. Letters of reference he had written himself, claiming he was a free man of color named Solomon King, a skilled businessman looking for employment. The most important piece of his escape wasn't the forged papers or the stolen money. It was his understanding of how the system worked. Marcus knew that New Orleans had a large population of free people of color, men and women who had been freed by masters, who had purchased their own freedom, or who had been born free in Louisiana's complex racial caste system. A light-skinned, educated black man with good clothes and the right papers could pass as free in New Orleans in a way that would be impossible anywhere else in the South. The city's very complexity became his camouflage. For the first 3 months after his escape, Solomon King, as he now called himself, lived in constant fear of discovery. He avoided the French Quarter where Crawford's associates might recognize him. He stayed in boarding houses in the working-class neighborhoods where free people of color lived. He changed his appearance, growing a beard, wearing spectacles, affecting a slight limp that changed his gait. He spoke only French in public, which was common among free Creoles, disguising the Mississippi accent that might mark him as a runaway slave. And he began to use the knowledge Crawford had inadvertently given him. He knew which establishments were fronts for illegal operations. He knew which politicians were corrupt and how much they charged for their protection. He knew the rhythms of the criminal underworld, when money moved and how it flowed. He started small, offering his services as a bookkeeper to a Creole gambler who needed help managing his accounts. The man, Jean-Baptiste Duclos, was impressed by Solomon's education and attention to detail. Within months, Solomon was managing 3 gambling operations, skimming a small percentage for himself while making the businesses more profitable. The key to Solomon's success was that he understood something most criminals of the era didn't. Organization and intelligence were more valuable than brute force. The criminal underworld of antebellum New Orleans was chaotic, controlled by various gangs who spent as much time fighting each other as running profitable enterprises. Solomon saw an opportunity. He began offering his services as a mediator, someone who could broker deals between rival operations, who could move money discreetly, who could manage the financial side of crime while others handled the violence. By 1846, 2 years after his escape, Solomon King controlled a network of gambling houses and managed the financial operations of half the illegal liquor trade in New Orleans. He lived in a modest apartment in the Treme neighborhood, dressed well but not ostentatiously, moved through the city with quiet confidence. He was known in the criminal underworld as a man of his word, someone who paid what he owed and expected the same from others. He was also known as someone who should not be crossed. On 2 occasions, men who tried to cheat him were found in the Mississippi River with their throats cut. Solomon never admitted responsibility, but the message was clear. What made Solomon different from other criminals was his understanding of slavery itself as a system of theft and violence. The entire economy of the South was built on stolen labor. The wealthiest men in New Orleans had made their fortunes by trafficking in human beings, by working people to death in cotton and sugar fields. Solomon looked at their respectable society and saw only criminals with better clothes and legal protection for their crimes. So he felt no guilt about stealing from them, no remorse about building his own empire on the margins of their empire. He also understood that the greatest vulnerability of the slave system was its moral corruption. Everyone was for sale. Politicians took bribes to look the other way. Police accepted payoffs to ignore crime. Even slaveholders themselves could be bought if the price was right. Solomon built his network by identifying corrupt officials and making them richer. He paid more than anyone else, was more reliable than anyone else, and slowly bought himself a level of protection that made him nearly untouchable. By 1850, Solomon King was one of the most powerful criminals in New Orleans, though few people knew his name. He owned 5 gambling houses outright, through front men who held the legal titles. He controlled a smuggling operation that moved stolen goods through the port. He had a piece of several brothels. His annual income was over $20,000, making him wealthier than many plantation owners. And he did it all while being a fugitive slave with a $5,000 bounty on his head. But Solomon's greatest achievement wasn't his wealth or his power. It was his invisibility. He had created a persona so convincing, so thoroughly documented with forged papers and bought witnesses, that he had essentially ceased to exist as Marcus Johnson. Solomon King was real. Marcus Johnson was the ghost. When slave catchers came through New Orleans looking for runaways, they never looked twice at the well-dressed businessman who spoke fluent French and carried letters of introduction from respected Creole families. When Crawford posted rewards for his escaped slave, no one connected the description of a scared teenage boy from 5 years ago to the sophisticated criminal who moved through New Orleans society. Solomon's true genius was understanding that racism worked in his favor. White people couldn't imagine that a black man, even a free black man, could be as intelligent and ruthless as he was. They saw him as a talented bookkeeper, a useful go-between, but never as the mastermind. He encouraged this misunderstanding, always working through intermediaries, always letting white men take credit for his ideas, always playing the role of the competent but subordinate colored man. And while they underestimated him, he built an empire. But in 1855, Solomon made his first major mistake. He fell in love. Her name was Claudette Moreau, a free woman of color who worked as a seamstress. She was 26 years old, beautiful and educated, the daughter of a French planter and his enslaved mistress who had been freed in his will. Claudette knew nothing of Solomon's criminal activities. She believed he was a successful merchant who had made his money in legitimate trade. They met at a church social, courted properly with chaperones, and were married in a small ceremony attended by Tremai's free-colored community. For 6 months, Solomon was happier than he had ever been. He had a wife he loved, a home that felt like a home rather than a hiding place, a life that seemed almost normal. He began to think about legitimacy, about using his illegal fortune to build legal businesses, about someday having children who would grow up free. He even considered telling Claudette the truth about who he really was. Then Nathaniel Crawford came to New Orleans. Solomon heard about it through his network. Crawford was in the city for a banking convention, staying at the St. Charles Hotel for 5 days. He had brought several associates, businessmen from Mississippi and Alabama. They were making deals, celebrating their wealth, enjoying the pleasures the city offered. And on the 3rd night of their stay, they had reserved a private dining room at the hotel for a celebration dinner. Solomon understood immediately that this was both a threat and an opportunity. Crawford might recognize him after 11 years, though it seemed unlikely given how much Solomon had changed. But if Crawford did recognize him, if Solomon was exposed as a runaway slave, everything would collapse. His freedom, his businesses, his marriage, his life. He would be dragged back to Mississippi in chains, likely killed as an example to other slaves who dreamed of escape. Or he could act first. He could eliminate Crawford before Crawford eliminated him. But it would have to be perfect. An outright murder would bring too much attention. It would have to look natural, accidental, or like the result of New Orleans' dangerous criminal underworld claiming another victim. Solomon spent 2 days planning. He used his connections to learn everything about Crawford's schedule, his associates, his habits. He learned that Crawford and 6 other businessmen would be dining together on March 15th, celebrating a major cotton deal. He learned that they had specifically requested discretion, a private room where they could discuss business without being overheard. He learned that Crawford had been drinking heavily since arriving in New Orleans, celebrating his good fortune. And Solomon had an idea that was both brilliant and insane. He would serve them dinner. He would walk into that room as a waiter, as an invisible servant, and he would be so close to Crawford that he could touch him. And Crawford wouldn't recognize him, because white men didn't really see black servants. They were furniture with voices, there to serve and then forgotten. On the night of March 15th, Solomon bribed his way into a waiter's uniform and position. He paid the hotel's head server $50 to let him take the place of one of the regular waiters serving the private dining room. It was an enormous risk. If Crawford recognized him, if any of the other diners had known him in Mississippi, if anyone suspected something wrong, he would be caught immediately. But Solomon had spent 11 years building an invisible identity. He had absolute confidence in his disguise, in his ability to play the subservient servant so convincingly that white men would look straight through him. The dinner began at 7 p.m. Solomon entered the private room carrying a tray of oysters, his head slightly bowed, his movements smooth and practiced. He set plates before each man, poured wine, smiled, and nodded at their jokes. Crawford sat at the head of the table, older now, his face ruddier, his belly larger, but still recognizably the man who had owned Marcus Johnson. Solomon stood 3 feet away from him, close enough to see the pores in his skin, and Crawford didn't even glance at him. It was in that moment that Solomon understood the full extent of his transformation. He wasn't Marcus Johnson anymore. That frightened teenage boy chained in a riverboat hold was dead and gone. Solomon King was real, more real than the slave had ever been, and he was standing in a room with his former master, who had no idea that his property was serving him wine. The dinner proceeded through multiple courses. Solomon learned about the deal they were celebrating, a scheme to buy cotton at depressed prices from desperate small planters and resell it at massive profit through their New Orleans connections. He heard them joke about the slaves they owned, comparing them to livestock, discussing breeding programs and punishment regimens as casually as they discussed horse racing. He heard Crawford boast about his success, about his properties, about his plans to expand his criminal enterprises now that his legitimate business was so profitable. And Solomon made his decision. He wouldn't just kill Crawford. He would take everything. Between courses, Solomon slipped out of the dining room and moved through the hotel to the office where important documents were locked in a safe. He had already bribed a clerk for the combination. Inside the safe, he found what he was looking for: contracts, promissory notes, deeds to property. The physical documents that represented Crawford's business dealings. He took everything related to Crawford and his associates, along with several other valuable papers that would complicate any investigation. He hid the documents in a bag he'd left in the kitchen, then returned to serving dinner. The 7th course was dessert, an elaborate confection with brandied cherries. Solomon served it personally to each man, adding something extra to 3 of the dishes. A powder he'd obtained from a voodoo priestess in the Treme, a mixture of belladonna and other plant toxins that would cause symptoms resembling severe food poisoning or heart failure. The dose was carefully calculated, enough to kill but not immediately, not in a way that would scream murder. By 10 p.m., the dinner was over. The men retired to smoke cigars and drink port. Solomon collected his payment, changed out of his uniform, and disappeared into the New Orleans night with a bag full of stolen documents worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Crawford died the next morning in his hotel room, clutching his chest and vomiting blood. The doctors called it heart failure brought on by overindulgence, not uncommon in wealthy, middle-aged men. 2 of his business associates died within 48 hours. Similar symptoms, similar diagnosis. 3 men dead of apparently natural causes. Tragic, but not suspicious. The surviving businessmen, shaken and frightened, departed New Orleans immediately, abandoning their business deals in their haste to leave the cursed city. And Solomon King, studying the stolen documents, realized he had just acquired control of a cotton trading operation, several properties in Mississippi and Louisiana, and enough compromising information on the surviving businessmen to blackmail them for years. Crawford's criminal enterprises, his gambling houses and brothels, his smuggling operations, all the infrastructure that Marcus Johnson had once helped manage, now belonged to Solomon King. But Solomon didn't move directly. He waited 6 months, letting the situation settle, letting Crawford's estate go through probate, letting the fear and confusion dissipate. Then he began making approaches to the surviving businessmen. Not threats, not demands, but business proposals. He had information they wanted to keep private. He had documents they needed. And he was willing to make deals. For a percentage of their operations, for partnerships in their businesses, for a piece of their profits. Most importantly, for their silence about his existence. By the end of 1857, Solomon controlled a criminal empire that stretched from New Orleans to Natchez, from the gambling dens of the Vieux Carré to the cotton warehouses on the riverfront. He had legitimate businesses that generated legal income and illegal operations that multiplied his wealth. He owned real estate under various false names. He had corrupt officials in his pocket. He was, by any measure, one of the most powerful criminals in the American South. And almost no one knew he existed. That was Solomon's greatest achievement. The white businessmen who paid him percentages thought they were dealing with various Creole intermediaries. The criminals who worked for him knew him only by reputation. Even his wife Claudette, though she suspected his wealth came from questionable sources, didn't understand the full extent of what her husband controlled. Solomon had become a phantom, a ghost who moved money and power through the shadows of New Orleans without ever fully revealing himself. But running a criminal empire brought its own problems. In 1858, a gang of Irish immigrants decided they wanted a piece of Solomon's operations. They were led by a brutal enforcer named Seamus Quinn, a man who had killed at least a dozen people in fights and thought violence was the solution to every problem. Quinn's gang started shaking down businesses that paid protection to Solomon, beating up dealers in Solomon's gambling houses, generally trying to muscle in on his territory. Solomon's lieutenants wanted to respond with violence, to send their own enforcers to kill Quinn and his men. But Solomon understood that a gang war would attract attention he couldn't afford. So instead, he used his greatest weapon: information. Through his network of paid informants, Solomon learned that Quinn and his gang were wanted in New York for murder. He passed this information to the New Orleans police, along with a bribe to make sure they acted on it. Quinn and 5 of his top men were arrested, extradited to New York, and eventually hanged. The rest of his gang, leaderless and frightened, accepted Solomon's offer to work for him instead of against him. The message was clear. Fighting Solomon King was bad for business and bad for health. It was better to make deals with the Phantom than to oppose him. By 1860, Solomon was 37 years old and had been free for 16 years. He had built an empire, amassed a fortune, created an identity so solid that he sometimes forgot he had ever been Marcus Johnson. He had a wife he loved, a home he owned, respect from the free-colored community, and power that most men could only dream of. He was living the life he had imagined as a teenage slave, reading forbidden books by candlelight. but maintaining his empire required constant vigilance and occasionally brutal demonstrations of power. One of the most significant challenges came in 1859, when a young, ambitious white criminal named William Davenport decided that a black man, even a free one, shouldn't control so much of New Orleans' underworld. Davenport was 28, wealthy from inheritance, and had the backing of several prominent families who found Solomon's success distasteful. He began a systematic campaign to destroy Solomon's operations, bribing officials that Solomon thought he controlled, intimidating businesses that paid Solomon protection, and spreading rumors that Solomon was actually a fugitive slave worth thousands in reward money. The rumors were the most dangerous part. Davenport had no proof, just suspicions based on inconsistencies in Solomon's background story. But in the paranoid atmosphere of the late 1850s, with slave rebellion fears at their height after John Brown's raid, even unproven accusations could be deadly for a black man. Solomon knew he had to act decisively. He spent 2 months gathering information on Davenport, learning everything about the man's life, his habits, his secrets. What he discovered was that Davenport had a weakness: opium. The young man was an addict, smoking in secret dens in the Chinese Quarter, spending fortunes on the drug while maintaining a respectable facade. Solomon saw his opportunity. He arranged for Davenport to receive an invitation to an exclusive opium den, supposedly patronized by wealthy Creole gentlemen. The invitation promised privacy, the finest quality opium from China, and beautiful women. Davenport couldn't resist. He arrived at the address, a warehouse near the docks, late on a humid August night. Inside, he found exactly what was promised: elegant furnishings, prepared opium pipes, comfortable couches. He smoked until he was helpless, floating in narcotic bliss. That's when Solomon appeared, not as the refined businessman in fine clothes, but dressed as a dock worker, his face shadowed, carrying a length of rope. He stood over Davenport, looking down at this white man who had tried to destroy him, who thought a black man's success was an affront to natural order. "You made a mistake," Solomon said quietly. "You thought because I'm black, I must be vulnerable. You thought you could take what I built and I'd just accept it because that's what you expect from people who look like me." Davenport tried to speak, his words slurred from opium. Solomon didn't let him finish. "I'm going to tell you something, Mr. Davenport. Something important. The world you live in, the world where white men rule and black men serve, that world is based on a lie. The lie is that you're superior, that your skin color makes you smarter, stronger, more deserving. But here's the truth. You're not superior. You're just protected by laws written by people who look like you. Take away those laws, take away that protection, and you're nothing but another man who can bleed and die." Solomon didn't kill Davenport that night. He did something more effective. He took photographs of the young man in the opium den, in compromising positions with women of various races. He gathered documentation of Davenport's drug purchases, his debts to Chinese smugglers, his embezzlement from his family's business to fund his habit. And then he made Davenport an offer: work for Solomon or be destroyed. The photographs would go to Davenport's family, to his fiancée's family, to the newspapers. The evidence of embezzlement would go to the police. Davenport's life as a respectable white gentleman would end, or he could become Solomon's agent, using his white skin and family connections to front legitimate businesses, to broker deals that Solomon couldn't make directly, to be the public face of operations that Solomon controlled from the shadows. Davenport chose survival. For the next 2 years, he worked for Solomon, hating every moment but unable to escape. He helped Solomon acquire properties, establish businesses, make connections with white society. He was a puppet, and Solomon held all his strings. And every time Davenport looked at Solomon, he saw his own powerlessness reflected back. The natural order he believed in had been inverted, and he was the one in chains now, not literal chains of iron, but chains of debt and blackmail and fear. This relationship gave Solomon something invaluable: access to levels of white society that even his money and fake papers couldn't reach. Through Davenport, Solomon invested in shipping companies, bought shares in banks, acquired real estate in the finest neighborhoods. All under Davenport's name, of course, but controlled by contracts that gave Solomon ultimate authority. He was building a legitimate fortune to complement his criminal empire, creating multiple layers of wealth and power that would protect him if any one layer was compromised. The system was brilliant and audacious. A fugitive slave controlling white businesses through a captive white agent. It was every slaveholder's nightmare made real. A black man holding power over a white man, inverting the racial hierarchy that justified slavery. Solomon took a deep satisfaction in this reversal, knowing that somewhere his mother was watching and smiling. But Davenport wasn't Solomon's only white agent. Over the years, he cultivated relationships with several corrupt officials, dishonest businessmen, and failing aristocrats who needed money more than they needed racial pride. He loaned them money at reasonable rates, helped them save their plantations or businesses from bankruptcy, asked for small favors in return. Before they realized what was happening, they were dependent on him, owed him too much to refuse further requests, trapped in webs of debt and obligation. Solomon was particularly successful at recruiting police officers and city officials. New Orleans government was spectacularly corrupt in the 1850s, with positions openly bought and sold, and officials expected to supplement their salaries through bribes and kickbacks. Solomon paid better than anyone else, was more reliable, and never asked his people to do anything that would genuinely endanger their positions. He wanted them in place, functioning, just occasionally looking the other way or providing useful information. By 1860, Solomon had at least a dozen white men on his payroll, from beat cops to city councilmen. They didn't think of themselves as working for a black man. They thought of themselves as taking money from various Creole intermediaries, from mysterious investors, from anyone but the phantom who really controlled the flow of cash. Solomon encouraged this delusion. As long as they took his money and did what he asked, he didn't care if they understood who they were really serving. His criminal operations expanded beyond New Orleans as well. He had connections in Mobile, Natchez, Baton Rouge, and even as far as Charleston. He moved stolen goods along the Mississippi River, smuggled contraband through the port, ran gambling operations in 3 states. The network was loosely organized, more a web of relationships than a formal hierarchy, which made it resilient. If one part was compromised, the rest continued functioning. Solomon also became involved in one of the most profitable and morally complex aspects of antebellum crime: helping slaves escape. This might seem contradictory for a man who was himself a criminal profiting from an unjust system, but Solomon saw it as both good business and a way to undermine the institution that had enslaved him. He charged wealthy enslaved people or their free relatives substantial fees to provide forged papers, transportation, and connections to underground railroad networks. His prices were high, but his success rate was nearly perfect. Between 1850 and 1860, Solomon helped approximately 40 enslaved people escape to freedom. Some were skilled artisans who had saved money for years. Others were the mixed-race children of wealthy white men who paid Solomon to remove the evidence of their indiscretions. A few were people Solomon helped for free, individuals whose stories reminded him too much of his own past. He never advertised this service and only worked with people who came through trusted intermediaries. But word spread through the enslaved community that if you had money and needed to disappear, the Phantom could make it happen. This work was incredibly dangerous. Helping slaves escape was a capital crime in most southern states. If caught, even Solomon's wealth and connections might not save him. But he did it anyway, partly for profit and partly because each successful escape was a small victory against the system that had stolen his childhood. Every person he helped to freedom was a piece of property that the slaveholders lost, a tiny crack in the edifice of slavery. Then the Civil War began, and everything changed. The war was both a threat and an opportunity. As Union forces moved south, as the Confederate economy collapsed, as the slave system began to unravel, Solomon saw chances to expand his operations. He smuggled goods through the blockade, sold supplies to both sides, used the chaos of war to move illegal merchandise with less oversight than ever before. His wealth doubled, then tripled. He bought properties from desperate planners at pennies on the dollar. He hired men who would have never worked for a black criminal in peacetime, but who needed money to survive. But the war also brought danger. As Union forces approached New Orleans in 1862, Confederate authorities began cracking down on suspected Union sympathizers, and free people of color were automatically suspect. Solomon's businesses, his properties, his whole carefully constructed identity came under scrutiny. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable, exposed. When Union forces captured New Orleans in May 1862, Solomon faced a choice. He could flee the city, abandoning his empire but securing his safety. Or he could stay and try to navigate the transition from Confederate to Union rule, risking everything but potentially emerging even more powerful. Solomon stayed, and he made a calculated decision that would define the rest of his life. He went to the Union military governor and offered his services. Not as a soldier, but as someone who knew the city, who had connections throughout New Orleans' criminal underworld, who could provide intelligence on Confederate sympathizers and help maintain order. He presented himself as a loyal Union man, a free person of color who had suffered under Confederate rule and wanted to help the Union cause. It was all lies, of course. Solomon didn't care about the Union or the Confederacy. He cared about his empire. But he understood that aligning with the winning side was good business. And the Union needed men like him, men who knew how the city really worked beneath its respectable surface. His gamble paid off. The Union military governor, General Benjamin Butler, was notoriously corrupt and willing to work with anyone who could help him maintain control and, more importantly, make money. Solomon became one of Butler's unofficial agents, using his criminal network to identify Confederate sympathizers, moving illegal goods for Union officers, helping to crack down on resistance while simultaneously profiting from the occupation. It was during this period that Solomon's true identity nearly came to light. A Mississippi planter, now a Confederate refugee in New Orleans, recognized him as a former slave. The man, a friend of Crawford's, confronted Solomon on the street, called him Marcus, threatened to expose him to the Union authorities. Solomon couldn't kill him directly without raising questions. So he used his connections with Butler's staff to have the man arrested as a Confederate spy. The man was imprisoned for 6 months, by which time the war had moved on and his accusations were ignored as the ravings of a defeated rebel. The war ended in 1865. Slavery was abolished. 4 million people walked free from bondage. And Solomon King, who had escaped slavery 21 years earlier, found himself in a world that had finally, officially, caught up to him. He was no longer a fugitive. He was simply a successful businessman, albeit one whose business was mostly illegal. In the post-war years, Solomon gradually transitioned from purely criminal enterprises to more legitimate businesses. He used his fortune to buy real estate, invest in shipping companies, establish banks that served the newly freed black population. He became known in New Orleans as a successful entrepreneur, a pillar of the black community, a man who had built himself up through hard work and intelligence. Only a handful of people knew the truth about his past or the source of his wealth. Solomon King died in 1892 at the age of 69, one of the wealthiest black men in the South. His funeral was attended by hundreds, black and white, criminals and civic leaders, people who knew him as a businessman and people who knew him as the Phantom. His obituary in the New Orleans newspapers praised him as an example of what freed people could accomplish with determination and enterprise. It made no mention of his origins as a slave, his years as a fugitive, or his empire built on gambling, smuggling, and extortion. His wife Claudette, who had lived with him for 37 years and borne him 4 children, revealed after his death that Solomon had told her everything on his deathbed. Who he really was, what he had done, how he had built his fortune. She kept his secret, destroyed documents that might have exposed the truth, and ensured that her husband's reputation remained intact. His children grew up believing their father was simply a shrewd businessman who had overcome poverty and prejudice to succeed. The truth about Solomon King stayed hidden for generations, preserved only in oral traditions within certain criminal circles and in the memories of old men who had worked for the Phantom. It wasn't until the 1970s, when historians began seriously studying black crime in the antebellum South, that Solomon's story started to emerge from the shadows. Even then, many details remained lost. His careful destruction of evidence too thorough, his identity too perfectly concealed. What we know for certain is this: Solomon King was a fugitive slave who became one of the most successful criminals in American history. He built an empire worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, controlled illegal operations across 3 states, corrupted officials and bought protection, and did it all while wanted as a runaway. He killed at least 4 people, possibly more, and felt no remorse because he saw himself as fighting a war against a system built on violence and theft. Was he a hero? No. He was a criminal who exploited others for profit, who used violence when necessary, who built his wealth on gambling, prostitution, and smuggling. But he was also a man who understood that the entire society he lived in was criminal, built on the greatest theft in human history: the stealing of millions of lives through slavery. In that context, his crimes seem almost quaint. What makes Solomon King's story remarkable isn't just that he escaped slavery and built a fortune. It's that he did it by becoming invisible in plain sight, by understanding that racism and white supremacy could be turned into camouflage, by using the underestimation of black intelligence as a weapon. He proved that even in the most oppressive system imaginable, there were cracks where a smart, ruthless, patient person could build power. His legacy is complicated. He helped other escaped slaves, providing money and forged papers for those trying to reach the North. But he also profited from the same corrupt system that kept millions in bondage. He accumulated wealth while others suffered. He was not a revolutionary trying to overthrow slavery, but an opportunist trying to carve out his own freedom within it. The question his story raises is whether his methods were justified by his circumstances. Solomon would have said yes. He believed that in a world where slavery was legal and white men grew rich selling black bodies, his crimes were no worse than theirs, and at least his benefited himself and his community rather than perpetuating oppression. Modern ethicists might disagree, might argue that crime is crime regardless of context. But they weren't the ones born into bondage, sold like livestock, forced to choose between submission and rebellion. Solomon King chose a third path. Not submission, not rebellion, but transformation. He became someone else, someone who could exist in the spaces between, who could accumulate power without drawing attention, who could win by making himself indispensable to both criminals and authorities. He was America's first black crime lord, not because he was the most violent or the most theatrical, but because he understood the business of crime better than anyone else. Because he built an organization that lasted decades. Because he protected his identity so well that his enemies never knew who they were fighting. His story was almost lost to history, erased by his own careful concealment and by a society that preferred not to acknowledge that enslaved people were capable of such intelligence and ruthlessness. But his descendants preserved fragments of truth, old letters and whispered stories, enough for historians to piece together the outline of his life, enough to understand that Solomon King was real, that the Phantom of New Orleans walked the streets for 50 years, and that somewhere in that city, a fugitive slave built an empire and died a respected businessman. The records show that in 1892, a man named Solomon King was buried in St. Louis Cemetery No. 2 in a marble tomb paid for by his children. The inscription reads, Solomon King, 1823-1892. Entrepreneur, philanthropist, beloved father. He made himself. That last line was apparently his own epitaph, chosen before his death. 4 words that summarized his entire philosophy. He made himself, not born free, not given freedom, but made himself into something that could be free. And perhaps that's the real lesson of his story. In a system designed to destroy black humanity, Solomon King insisted on his own humanity so fiercely that he transformed himself from property into person, from slave into king. His methods were criminal. His actions were often brutal. But his achievement was remarkable. He proved that even slavery, even the most complete oppression imaginable, could be overcome by someone smart enough, patient enough, ruthless enough to refuse the role they were assigned. The Phantom of New Orleans was real, and his empire, built on stolen documents and poisoned desserts, on bribed officials and strategic murders, on perfect disguises and calculated risks, stood for half a century as proof that even in the darkest times, even in the most brutal systems, some people find a way to be free. Not by asking permission, not by waiting for salvation, but by taking what they wanted and defending it with everything they had. Subscribe to hear more forgotten stories from history. Stories that challenge our understanding of crime and justice, of slavery and freedom, of who gets to be a hero and who gets called a villain. Solomon King's story deserves to be remembered, not because it's comfortable, but because it's true. And the truth is always more complicated than we want it to be. The man they called the Phantom walked freely through New Orleans for 50 years while wanted as a fugitive slave. He dined with criminals and officials, built an empire, raised a family, died in bed surrounded by people who loved him. And his greatest trick wasn't disappearing. It was hiding in plain sight. Invisible because no one believed a black man could be that smart, that dangerous, that successful. He turned their racism into armor and their greed into opportunity. And he won a war they never knew they were fighting. That's the story of Solomon King, the fugitive who became a phantom, the slave who became a crime lord, the man who made himself.